I'll make up a title for this podcast along the lines of what the book says. Basically, I'm continuing in chapter 2, which is called Our Past Defining Our Present. So we will continue this, and I'll call it Our Evolution, Our... what did I call it? I don't even know what I call it. Our evolution, our transformation. So we'll look at some transformations we have gone through over time. Some intentional, some just happen, accidental, serendipities, and so on. We live in on an extraordinary planet, which has been said in many ways. During its more than 4.5 billion years of existence, it has been changing continuously from a burning inferno without an atmosphere to a planet with continents and oceans. So when the solar system began to form, Earth was still just a primordial soup with lots of meteorite strikes, and continents hadn't formed, and so on. Although early forms of life had appeared around 4 billion years before, it was not until 200,000 years ago that the first anatomically modern humans treaded the African soil. This number keeps changing, but you can go ahead and take this number for now. Thus, this relatively young species turned out to be exceptionally good at adapting to new environments and spread from continent to continent, replacing the Neanderthals and the earlier human species. We had our hominin ancestors, Australopithecus, Ardipithecus, Kenyanthropus, the monkeys, great apes, and bipedals, and then evolution and how Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Floresiensis, Neanderthalensis, everybody disappeared. Here we are standing alone. Around 10,000 years ago, the entire world was colonized by Homo sapiens except Antarctica. The more successful early migrations out of Africa 60,000 years ago seem to have coincided with the favorable climate conditions and our ancestors reaching full behavioral modernity. Again, this timeline also keeps changing based on more evidence is coming to light, and more evidences on whether there was really out of Africa and then evolution, or there were parallel evolutions at some point, Devonians and so on. But nonetheless, the marine isotope stages have been looked at more carefully for the past 135,000 years ago on how Homo sapiens dealt with climate change, sea level rise, warming, cooling, ice ages, and so on. So where was I? The more successful early migrations out of Africa 60,000 years ago seem to have coincided with favorable conditions and our ancestors reaching full behavioral modernity, i.e., the appearance of fully articulate speech, intelligence, and creativity relative to humans today. Regardless if this cognitive change was sudden or more gradual, it represents a fundamental transformation and is referred to as the Upper Paleolithic Revolution, the Stone Age, right? The resulting boost in the complexity of the technological, economic, social, cognitive behaviors of certain groups gave them a competitive edge over others, who in turn would either learn or lose. Although our prevailing ancestors remained hunters and gatherers, systematic exploitation of raw material and tool production became common practice, and specialized utensils, hunting tools appeared, symbols, decorations, and jewelry emerged, and long-distance exchange networks for raw material and manufactured products were established. So there is a very quick run through many centuries, many millennia of time scales actually, in terms of how complex society grew, complex societies began to form, hierarchy in the societies, technological prowess, weapons, wars, governance structures, and diaspora along with it, and potentially wars, right? So early migrations of modern humans based on this book Haywood 2011 here, you can start here 200,000 years ago. You have directions, there are still timelines being worked out as to why there were earlier arrivals here all the way than just here so close, but you can see how evidences change. So you have 100,000, 200,000, 100,000 years ago, 70,000 years, 50,000 years ago and 50,000 years ago here. So let's be careful. Yeah, so this is more recent, 30,000 years ago here, 45 to 35. So this branch is faster, 100,000 to 45,000 to 10,000 years ago here, very recent in the Holocene. And then this timeline remains very vague still, maybe 16,000 inland route to 13,500, but there may have been coastal migrations down into South America at 14,500, but these timelines are still evolving. So these are estimated early migration routes of anatomically modern humans. So there are some differences from us, but they were basically bipedals with opposable thumbs and, you know, Adam's apple in a certain position and so on. Numbers indicate the known first arrival in years before present. The map is shown with modern coastlines because there have been some changes in tectonic plates along the way, even though at these time scales they're not very major at all. Okay, so although humans had colonized all corners of our planet in 10,000 BC after the last ice age ended and we had deglaciated, the global population remained at 4 million, obviously an estimate, and the environmental impact was nominal of humans on the planet. Even with all the advances of the Upper Paleolithic Revolution, humans lived off their environment without consciously changing it. Hunter-gatherers. The challenge for these hunter-gatherer societies was the production of sufficient quantities of food, which was regulated by the natural carrying capacity of each ecosystem, meaning that local overpopulation had only two outcomes: migration or starvation. There are some nice studies which show how many species went extinct here over time compared to arrival of humans versus climate change, and how many went extinct here or here. It turns out that far fewer species went extinct here, especially if you look at the megafauna, than here, because the late arrival of the humans actually ended up them hunting and consuming whatever was available or killing whatever they felt was a threat, whereas here they probably co-evolved and far fewer species went extinct. So those kind of ideas exist as well. Okay, then suddenly between 8,000 and 5,000 BC, groups of humans in a number of independent locations around the world started to cultivate plants and domesticate animals, which could have been, accidental. So grass, many of the grasses, C3 plants like rice, wheat, or corn, maybe they were all growing. Make sure that I'm saying all the right things in terms of the grains. They were growing naturally in the wild, but we found them to be very useful for us and started domesticating them. And of course, we definitely domesticated animals, which led to breeding of dogs from wolves and cattle and so on. This change marked a second fundamental transformation of society and is referred to as the Neolithic Revolution. Regardless of the reasons behind this transformation, which have been heavily debated over the years, and nobody is quite sure why such a step was taken, it marked the start of humans actively changing their environment to suit their purposes. So once you domesticated grains, plants, cereals, then or fruits, vegetables, whatever, you settle down. You are not hunter-gatherers anymore. So there is some evidence that fertility rates went up because women were not running around. Then families, monogamy could have evolved, and then population began to explode. Demand for food increased, so you had to create more arable agricultural land. So you started to deforest and so on. So human activity began to expand quickly and started to change the environment. I'm jumping many paragraphs here. I'm just picking snippets. Okay, villages started to be protected by palisades, and purpose-made weapons for war appeared. The discovery of copper and the subsequent invention of bronze in the Near East around 3300 BC made weapons deadlier and tools more efficient. So we were beginning to get out of the Stone Age. Pack animals, boats, and wheeled vehicles made it possible to gather food in a few locations, which also facilitated protection. So if you had more food, better rains, and population was growing and somebody was starving, maybe they got adventurous and wanted to steal from you, so you began to develop protection, not only in terms of storing grains for the future, but also protecting arms and weapons to protect your assets, right? Then as the intervention of bronze spread over the world, the surplus of food in the more advanced communities could support a substantial number of individuals who were themselves fully released from food production and could focus on their functions. The world population had in 3000 BC reached 14 million, more than 3 times the 4 million we started with, and the first cities had emerged. So urban concentrated populations with more facilities, in some ways more wealth, more governance hierarchies and so on began to evolve. Innovation centers as well. Cities have become ecosystems of innovation. New technology was developed to sustain the growing populations of cities, such as terracing, which we'll see in a figure in a minute, and river replenishment of fertility. Our ancestors saw dams, wells, etc. Water has always been a big part of human adaptation to climate change or climate variability. Our ancestors were, in other words, not only actively changing their environment in the sense of clearing fields and creating monocultures, but also changing the flow of rivers and the topography to suit their purposes. So large-scale changes already were underway. So Bill Ruddiman would argue that climate change had already begun and greenhouse gas emissions had already begun by then. The capacity to move soil and rock had improved as the tools developed from bones and antlers to increasingly refined tools of bone, wood, stone and bronze came along. Although the Paleolithic flint mines were impressive considering the available technology, the pyramids of Egypt and other massive Bronze Age structures around the world are still mesmerizing scholars and visitors alike. There are many structures across the planet, the Great Wall at much newer temples and various other water structures, water harvesting, fog harvesting and so on and so forth. So here is the myth of the Tower of the Babel that was inspired by the great architecture of the early Mesopotamian cities. So you can see how concentrated populations evolved around water bodies with all kinds of social structures that you can see here. Okay, workers, maybe rich people, maybe laborers, agriculture, trade, boats and armies, weapons, protection and so on. The ancient innovation of terracing, so agriculture on terraces allowed primitive forms of irrigation or water management on slopes to grow food. So lots of places in Southeast Asia, South America and so on had terracing happening. So agriculture grew, domestication of cereals and livestock grew in different places and spread differently, rice, peppers, whatever else. Lots of spreading of crops and technologies and agricultural methods happened along the way. So longish text here, but maybe we'll come back and continue because this one is again already more than 13.5 minutes. So you get the idea that we are building the history of humans from before the Holocene, beginning of the Holocene, into the last ice age. You can actually go even before that, but the information is not so relevant for the kind of transformations we are talking about, going into where we are now in the Anthropocene, so that we can think about the future for sustainability. Okay, so we'll come back and continue.